Sometimes providence hides in the simplest moments of life. The sun was beginning to bid farewell to the hills as Thomas Miller guided his horse along the trail that bordered the Colorado River. 42 years of living in the American West had taught the farmer that each evening brought its own mysteries. The wind blew gently through the willows, carrying the aroma of damp earth and wildflowers that grew on the stony shores. His property was only a few miles away, but Thomas always took the long way out when he needed to think. The farm had prospered in recent years. The cattle were fat and healthy, the fences neatly maintained, and the wooden house he had built with his own hands stood solid against the storms of summer and the icy winds of winter. But loneliness weighed on her shoulders like a wet blanket. 3 years had passed since he buried Martha, his wife, a victim of the fever that ravaged the region. Since then, Thomas has divided his days between hard work and the silence that echoed through the empty rooms of his house. Thomas's horse slowed its pace naturally, as if he also felt the melancholy of the moment. The waters of the river flowed smoothly, reflecting the first stars that timidly appeared in the orange sky. It was at this time of day that Martha used to sit on the porch, knitting while watching the nocturnal birds move. Thomas shook his head, brushing away the memories that insisted on visiting his mind in moments of stillness. It was then that he saw a figure stretched out on the bank of the river, partially hidden among the rocks and the undergrowth. Thomas's heart raced immediately. From a distance he appeared to be a person, but the immobility of the form made him fear the worst. He quickly got off his horse and approached cautiously. It was a young woman. Her brown hair spread over the damp sand like threads of dark silk. Her clothes, although simple, suggested that she came from some nearby city, not one of the women who lived in the isolated ranches of the region. Thomas knelt next to the stranger and noticed that she was breathing, albeit irregularly. His face was pale, but he had no visible injuries. She just looked exhausted, as if she had walked for days without rest. Dewdrops covered his clothes and hair, indicating that he had been there for some time. The farmer looked around, looking for signs of a horse or wagon, but found nothing. The woman had arrived there on foot, alone, in a territory that few ventured to travel alone. The protective instinct that Thomas has developed over the years of tending to his farm and the animals was immediately awakened. He could not leave that woman there, vulnerable to the beasts that came down from the mountains in search of water at night. Carefully, he wrapped his arms under her body and lifted her up. It was lighter than he expected, and Thomas felt a strange familiarity in that gesture, as if he were carrying something precious he had lost long ago. He put the unconscious woman on his horse and mounted behind her, keeping her safe in his arms during the ride to the farm. The animal seemed to understand the urgency of the situation and quickened its pace naturally. All the way, Thomas watched the stranger's serene face, wondering what circumstances had brought her to that lonely bank of the river. There was something in his expression that suggested not only physical fatigue, but a deep sadness that he recognized in himself. Upon arriving at the farm, Thomas lit the house's lamps and prepared the guest room that had not received anyone in years. He gently placed the woman on the bed and covered her with a woolen blanket that Martha had woven. He sat in the chair next to the bed and waited, watching the gentle movement of his breathing. From time to time, she would murmur unintelligible words, as if she were having a disturbing dream. The night progressed slowly, and Thomas remained there, watching over the stranger's sleep. There was something about that situation that awakened in him a feeling that he had not experienced in years, that of being needed by someone. Looking out the window, he saw the first lights of dawn painting the horizon golden, and he knew that his life had changed that night. He did not yet know the name of this woman or where she came from, but he felt that fate had put them both on the same path for a reason he did not yet fully understand. The first ray of sunlight that came through the bedroom window brought with it the awakening of the mysterious woman. Thomas had fallen asleep in his chair during the early hours of the morning, but the soft sound of movement in bed woke him up immediately. He opened his eyes and saw that she was sitting, observing the environment with a mixture of confusion and caution. His green eyes reflected a keen intelligence, but also a deep sadness that seemed to be etched in his soul. She didn't speak immediately, just continued scanning the simple but cozy room, the light wood walls, the flowered curtains that Martha had sewn, the small table with a jug of water and a basin to wash in. Thomas remained motionless, hoping she felt safe enough to break the silence that hung between them. I had learned over the years that some people needed time to find the right words, especially when they carried invisible wounds. When their eyes finally met, Thomas saw in them a quiet gratitude, but also a vulnerability that touched him deeply. She seemed to be evaluating whether she could trust him, whether this place represented safety or another threat on her journey. The farmer stood up slowly, keeping a respectful distance, and waved toward the jug of water. She nodded almost imperceptibly and drank as if she hadn't tasted water in days. While she was freshening up, Thomas prepared a simple breakfast in the kitchen. Fresh eggs from his chickens, bread he had baked 2 days earlier, berry jam he had picked the previous fall. He moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had learned to take care of himself, but there was a tenderness in his gestures that he hadn't shown for a long time. He was preparing food for someone again, and it sparked in him a sense of purpose that he had forgotten existed. When he returned to the room carrying a tray, he found the woman standing by the window, watching the fields that stretched to the horizon. The golden light of the morning illuminated his profile, revealing delicate features but marked by difficult experiences. There was a subtle line of determination on his chin that contrasted with the apparent fragility of his condition. Thomas placed the tray on the table and waited. She turned around and for the first time sketched something that could be called a smile. It was not joy, but an acknowledgement of goodness that I did not expect to find. He sat up on the bed and began to eat slowly, savoring each morsel as if it were the first decent food he had tasted in weeks. Thomas noticed that his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from physical weakness. He had walked a lot and eaten shortly before fainting on the riverbank. During breakfast, she began to speak in a low voice, as if testing her own ability to form words. He said her name was Sarah Bennett, who was coming from the town of Cedar Falls, 3 days' ride away. She had lost everything in a fire that devastated the small boarding house where she worked as a housekeeper. He had no close family, just a few savings that he kept in a tin can buried at the back of the property, but which he was unable to recover before fleeing the flames. Thomas listened without interruption, recognizing in Sarah's story echoes of his own experience with loss. There was something about the way she talked about starting over that reminded him of his own moments of despair after Martha's death. The difference was that he had his land, his animals, a structure that sustained him through the darkest moments. Sarah had nothing but the clothes on her back and an iron determination to keep on living. When she finished eating, Sarah asked if she could stay just one more day to regain her strength before continuing her journey. She did not specify where she intended to go, and Thomas suspected that she did not know herself. There was something in his eyes that suggested she was running away from more than just a fire, but he didn't press for details. Each person carried their own secrets, and he respected that. The farmer replied that she could stay as long as necessary. There was work on the farm that a woman could do if she was interested, and the house was too big for one person. It was not charity, he explained, but a mutually beneficial proposal. Sarah studied her face for a long moment, looking for signs of hidden intentions, but found only honesty and a loneliness that mirrored her own. That afternoon, while Sarah rested, Thomas went about his daily chores with renewed energy. He fed the cattle, repaired a broken fence, organized the tools in the barn, but his thoughts constantly returned to the woman who slept in his house. There was something about her that awakened in him not only compassion, but a hope that he thought he had lost forever. Perhaps it was possible that two broken people could help each other become whole again, As the sun began to set, Thomas found Sarah on the porch, sitting in the same chair where Martha used to spend her afternoons. She watched the distant mountains with a thoughtful expression, as if she were making an important decision. The gentle wind played with her hair, and for the first time since he found her, she seemed to be truly at peace. Thomas sat in the chair next to him, and together they watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Two strangers united by circumstance and by the hope that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. The days that followed brought an unexpectedly harmonious routine to Thomas's farm. Sarah had agreed to stay and help with household chores, and her presence transformed the atmosphere of the house in subtle but profound ways. She tended the garden with a dedication that revealed practical knowledge about plants and cultivation. His hands, although delicate, knew when to water, when to prune, when to harvest. Thomas watched from afar, impressed by the natural way she adapted to this life. The kitchen of the house came back to life. Sarah prepared meals that filled the room with scents that Thomas hadn't smelled in years. They were not elaborate dishes, but there was a care in each preparation that transformed the simple ingredients into something special. She discovered the recipes written down by Martha in a dusty notebook and followed them with respect, as if she were honoring the memory of someone she had never met, but who felt present in that house. Thomas realized that Sarah had nightmares. During the night, he heard muffled sounds coming from the guest room, anguished whispers that revealed that she carried wounds deeper than the fire that brought her there. One morning, he found her in the kitchen before dawn, preparing coffee with trembling hands. She had cried, that was evident, but she offered no explanation, and he did not ask. He simply sat down at the table and accepted the cup she offered him, sharing the silence and mutual understanding. Work on the farm became lighter with Sarah around. She fed the chickens every morning, talking to them as if they were old friends. He helped milk the cows, his hands quickly learning the right rhythm. Thomas taught her about caring for livestock, and she demonstrated a natural intuition for dealing with animals. There was a patience in her that perfectly complemented his experience. In the afternoons, when the heavier work was done, they would sit on the porch and talk about little things. Sarah talked about the books she had read in school, about the flowers she liked to grow, about recipes she had learned from other women over the years. Thomas shared stories about the construction of the farm, about the harsh winters he had endured, about the moments of satisfaction when he saw his flock grow healthy. But it was during one of these conversations that the peace was broken. A rider appeared on the road leading to the farm, riding a black horse and wearing clothing that suggested authority. Thomas immediately recognized the type, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, regardless of the means necessary. Sarah turned pale at the sight of him and instinctively moved behind Thomas, seeking protection. The man introduced himself as Marcus Dalton, a landowner in Cedar Falls. He said he was looking for a woman who had fled his property without fulfilling a work agreement. He described Sarah in too precise detail to be a coincidence. Thomas felt the tension radiate from her body behind him and realized that there was much more to Sarah's story than she had revealed. The fire may have been real, but it was not the only reason for his escape. Dalton talked about contracts and obligations, about debts that needed to be paid, and responsibilities that could not be ignored. His words were formally courteous, but there was an underlying threat that made Thomas clench his fists. I had known men like Dalton before, men who saw other people as property to be controlled. The way he looked at Sarah, even though he tried to look professional, revealed intentions that went beyond financial matters. Thomas stood firmly between Dalton and Sarah. He said he did not know any runaway women and that his property was not open to unauthorized searches. Dalton smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and suggested that Thomas might not fully understand the situation. There were laws to be respected, contracts to be honored. People couldn't just disappear when they had outstanding debts. The conversation went on for a tense few minutes, with Dalton pressing and Thomas resisting with a firmness that surprised himself. It had been years since he felt so determined to protect something or someone. Sarah remained silent behind him, but Thomas could feel her quickening breathing, the fear that emanated from her body like the warmth of a campfire. Finally, Dalton mounted his horse again, but before leaving, he made a point of mentioning that he would be staying in the neighboring town for a few days. Cases like this rarely resolved quickly, he observed with a cold smile. There were always ways to convince reluctant people to be more cooperative. Thomas watched him leave with a sense of restlessness growing in his chest. When he turned to Sarah, he found her with tears in her eyes. She began to speak quickly, trying to explain, but Thomas interrupted her gently. He said that it didn't matter what had happened before, that what mattered was that she was there now, safe, and that he wouldn't allow anyone to take her against her will. There was something about the determination of his voice that reassured Sarah, but they both knew that Dalton would not give up easily. That night, Thomas remained awake, planning. He knew men like Dalton. He knew that they did not back down in the face of obstacles. There were ways to deal with this situation, but it would require courage and perhaps sacrifices that he hadn't made in years. Looking out the window toward the room where Sarah had finally been able to fall asleep, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of both of their lives forever. The next morning brought clarity that only difficult decisions can provide. Thomas woke up to the sound of Sarah preparing coffee in the kitchen, but there was a tension in the air that they both felt. During breakfast, she finally told the whole truth. Dalton was not just a landowner, but a man who controlled several women through fraudulent contracts, keeping them trapped in forced labor situations under the justification of imaginary debts. Sarah had managed to escape when she discovered that other women before her had simply disappeared when they tried to resist Dalton's advances. The fire had been real, but she suspected it wasn't accidental. Dalton had ways of solving problems that became too inconvenient. The courage that had brought her there was running out, and she feared that her presence would put Thomas in danger. Thomas listened to everything in silence, his expression becoming darker with each revelation. When Sarah suggested that maybe she had better leave before Dalton returned, he nodded firmly. She had made her decision during the sleepless night, and nothing she revealed changed her. In fact, it only strengthened his resolve. No man had the right to treat another human being in this way, and he would not allow this to happen on his land. During the afternoon, Thomas rode to the nearest town. He did not go looking for Dalton, but Sheriff Henderson, an honest man he had known for many years. He presented the information Sarah had shared and found that other similar reports had come to the attention of the authorities. Dalton was suspected of various wrongdoings, but the evidence always mysteriously disappeared, and witnesses became reluctant to speak out. Henderson explained that he needed concrete evidence and witnesses willing to testify in order to act. Thomas assured her that Sarah would be willing to testify, but he knew that it would require extraordinary courage on his part. When he returned to the farm at dusk, he found Sarah waiting on the porch, watching the road anxiously. His eyes revealed relief when he saw him return safe and sound. Thomas told of his conversation with the sheriff and the plan they had developed. Sarah listened with a mixture of hope and fear, but when he finished, she nodded with determination. I was tired of running away, tired of living in fear. If there was a chance to prevent other women from suffering what she had suffered, she was willing to take the risk. The next morning, Dalton returned as promised, but this time he was not alone. He brought 2 men with him, clearly hoping to intimidate Thomas through numerical superiority, but the farmer had prepared for this possibility. Henderson and 2 deputies were hiding in the barn, waiting for the right moment to act. Thomas had learned over the years that sometimes it was necessary to fight for what was right. The conversation began in the same way as the day before, with Dalton making polite but threatening demands. This time, however, Thomas allowed him to talk enough to incriminate himself. Dalton, confident in his position of power, revealed details about his methods of control and made veiled threats about what would happen to Thomas if he continued to interfere. Every word was carefully recorded by the hidden men of the law. When Henderson finally emerged from the barn with his deputies, Dalton's expression quickly changed from confidence to alarm. The evidence they had collected, combined with Sarah's testimony and the admissions Dalton had made moments earlier, were sufficient for his arrest. The two men who accompanied him surrendered without resistance when they realized they were surrounded. Sarah watched everything from the balcony, her hands shaking not from fear, but from an emotional release she had built up during months of terror. When Dalton was taken away, she felt as if an immense weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he could breathe freely without looking over his shoulder. In the weeks that followed, more women came forward to testify against Dalton. Sarah has helped many of them find honest work and safe places to live. She found that helping others rebuild their lives helped her heal her own wounds. Thomas's farm temporarily became a refuge for women who needed a safe place to reorganize. During this time, Thomas and Sarah found that their initial need-based partnership had morphed into something much deeper. It was not a sudden or dramatic romance, but a gradual growth of affection, respect, and mutual understanding. Both had lost a lot in life, but together they found a way to build something new and meaningful. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Sarah commented that she had never felt so safe and at peace. Thomas stopped digging and looked at her, seeing no longer the frail woman he had met on the riverbank, but a strong person who had faced his fears and won. She smiled at him, a genuine, full smile that lit up her face. The sun set over the hills, painting the sky with shades of gold and carmine. The farm stretched around them, prosperous and full of life. Thomas took Sarah's hand between his, calloused from work, but gentle to the touch. They didn't need words to express what they both felt. They had found not only security in each other, but also a chance to start over. Months later, when the other women had gone their own ways, and life on the farm had resumed its quiet routine, Sarah and Thomas were married in a simple ceremony at the town's church. Henderson was one of the witnesses, smiling as he saw how two people who had suffered so much managed to find happiness together. That night, sitting on the porch under a starry sky, Thomas held Sarah close to him and whispered the words that had started it all. "Come closer. You are not alone." This time, however, they had a completely different meaning. They were no longer words of consolation to a stranger in despair, but a promise of love and companionship that would last forever. The farm continued to prosper under the care of both. Sarah transformed the house into a real home, while Thomas found in his work a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they built a life based on mutual respect, trust, and the certainty that love can flourish even after the most terrible storms. Sometimes, when Thomas rode along the trail that bordered the Colorado River, he would stop at the spot where he had met Sarah that night that changed their lives forever. He smiled as he remembered the providence that had united them and the courage they both had to believe that it was possible to start over. The wind was still blowing gently among the willows, but now it carried only promises of better days to come. If this story touched your heart and you enjoyed following Thomas and Sarah's journey in the Wild West, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have many more exciting stories waiting for you, filled with adventure, courage, and hope.